Okay, good morning. We want to start the Shmona Prakim, Rambam's introduction to Maseches Ovos. And there's a bit to talk about translations as a phenom, and it's a little off the beaten track, so it might pay to spend a couple of minutes about talking about it. The first thing is that the Abbasid dynasty conquered really much of the known world, really, by the year 750. And when I speak about the known world, I'm talking more specifically about Spain, starting looking at a map. Spain, go down, North Africa, move east to Egypt, Israel, Syria, Iraq, Babylonia, and Persia, and even further east. Okay, this took place in 750. In 762, they moved the caliphate from Damascus, from Damascus to Baghdad, and they started their famous translation project, in which they translated the complete inheritance of science and philosophy from classical antiquity into Arabic. And indeed, from then on, anything that our interest, the Rambam, anything he knew of classical antiquity came by way of Arabic translations or Arabic commentary, paraphrases of the earlier material or commentary on the material. From the Rambam, from his orbit, it came up to Provence with the family of Ibn Tivin. When the Almohadin persecution in Spain pushed the Rambam south to North Africa and then ending up in Egypt, the Ibn Tibbins went north and ended up in Provence. And the father, Yehuda Ibn Tibbin, started the movement, and his son, Shmuel Ibn Tibbin, was indeed the great translator. Of course, he translated Moreh Nevuchim, but he also translated Maseches Ovos. The next thing is that and he also translated, by the way, Aristotle's meteorology. So this whole business of now translating the Arabic culture now started moving to southern France, and from there into Europe, and it went into Europe from Hebrew to Latin, and remained that way until the Renaissance and the Reformation, when there was great interest in recovering the original Greek, and as well as non-Jewish scholars were interested in discovering original Hebrew. Namely, there was interest in the Hebrew Bible in the original and in the New Testament in the original, among other things, besides the general classical interest in classical Greece. That's the first thing about translations. Second thing about translations is Shmuel Ibn Tibbin's translation only did that part of Maseches Ovos. Translations of the Rambam's commentary to the Mishnah are piecemeal. There was an excellent translation for all of Nezikin, except for Maseches Ovos, Shmuel Ibn Tibbin, much later. And other Masechtos, or parts of them, are done by other people. And by the time they ended up getting into a unit, into print, they weren't in the greatest of shape. And then their subsequent printings, of course, introduced problems and problems and problems. Okay. The next step is contemporary almost. There's Rabbi Yosef Kapach, was one of the Olei Teiman that came to Eretz Yisrael. And he was a tremendous, tremendous Talmid Chacham who studied under the tutelage of his grandfather. They studied everything in Arabic, original, okay? So Yosef Kapach translated works of Saadia Gaon. I have his Emunos Videos in the house. His Perush on Sefer Yetzirah in the house, okay? I might have other stuff also. These have come to mind right now. And he translated the commentary to them, and he translated certainly the Rambam's Moreh Nevuchim for sure. He also gave a translation to the whole commentary to the Mishnah. So it's an even translation, at least a consistent translation, high quality translation. The big excitement that took place in recent times on top of this is that the original autograph copy, when I say autograph, not that he signed it at the end, I mean auto-written, mamash ksav yado hakdosha, of the Rambam, is found in various libraries in the world, different parts of it. And indeed, when Rabbi Yosef Kapach started to do his commentary, they kept sending him, versions of the, I guess, microfilms at the time. And for some reason, there was a big delay in sending him Maseches Ovos. So he worked with his Yemenite manuscripts, right? And for a certain, because they were done in a isolated culture, in a certain sense, very few hands tampered with them, you might say, and they were pretty reliable. And then turns out that the Rambam's autograph copy has Ovos, and then ultimately the rest of the commentary, it came out, and by now there are facsimiles of it that people can study it, and you can see actually where the Rambam crosses stuff out and recorrects it. And the main purpose of it, there are two purposes. One is that to improve a formulation, but the second one is more important, that by the time he wrote the Mishnah Torah, he may have changed his mind. And he wanted his commentary to the Mishnah to be up to date. So that was very important. Okay. Rabbi Yitzchak Shilat, who was a Rosh Hashiva in Ma'aleh Adumim, he gave out a book of all the introductions of the Rambam, those on the Mishnah and elsewhere. So he certainly wanted to use the original manuscript of the Rambam. And Maseches Avos, he has an artificial argument that even though Rav Kapach's Hebrew is very contemporary Hebrew, so Rabbi Yitzchak Shilat makes a lot of noise about returning to Shmuel ibn Tibbon's Hebrew, and as being more authentic, of being the Hebrew that was at the time of the original translation, and that reflected more medieval sensibilities than contemporary Hebrew. So he published a translation. I personally think that he just did not want to upstage Rabbi Yosef Kapach. That's my personal feeling. He says that changes of better formulations are very, very slight and not a big deal at all. But he feels there's only one place where there is, quote unquote, a mistake. Okay, read it. That's it. So I think he just wanted to be a true gentleman. It's my personal reading of that. It seems artificial, so it's my own reading. And he wrote it, and later, Michael Schwartz now gave out a translation predicated on the Rambam's autograph in contemporary Hebrew. So there's a whole collection of them. An oddball phenom that goes with translating things to contemporary Hebrew. There's a website called Da'at in Israel, which puts out all original stuff in Hebrew. And they put up Shmuel ibn Tibbon's translation. Okay. And they said, well, we had to fiddle a little with it, because if a word hitamlut shows up in the translation, in Ibn Tibbon, hitamlut means tremendous effort. But a modern reader will think hitamlut, going to a gym. What's the Rambam talking about? So they fiddled. Those kinds of things they fiddle with, but otherwise they stay with Shmuel ibn Tibbon's translation. Okay. The issue of writing introductions, turns out that Sarah Klein Brasalavi has an introduction to Michael Schwartz's translation. And she says that the writing of introductions is a literary genre that goes back to classical antiquity. And it achieved almost like a definitive formal form in Alexandria, in Egypt, in the 5th and 6th century, Hellenistic Alexandria. And apparently an introduction was supposed to have like 6 to 8 specific things that it discussed as an introduction to the book. By the time this cultural inheritance made its way into the Arabic culture and then from Hebrew into Europe, the formality of introductions had fallen by the wayside, okay? And people wrote introductions as they felt necessary, shall we say, okay? The Rambam loved writing introductions. I think he took it as the opportunity to place a stamp on the book in advance to let you know how he's thinking about the book. He wrote into a general introduction to the Mishnah, big introduction to Mishnah Torah. He wrote an introduction to Chelek, the chapter in Masechah Sanhedrin that talks about Yemei HaMashiach, Olam Haba, stuff like that. The introduction to Avos, so those are where he took, these introductions talk about the tradition, ideas, etc. And then he wrote halachic introductions. He did one for Zvachim, and for Kodeshim, and for Taharos, he wrote introductions, where he organized the materials, okay? He also, Maseches Kinim is very difficult, so he wrote an introduction there, and Hurios. There may be some other, I forget which ones. So, and the Zvachim and Tahara, the one for Kodeshim and Taharos are major summary statements of organizing everything so that you can then really read the Mishnayos intelligently. Remember, these two sections were not living sections, so nobody has any cultural connection with them. Nobody has any comfortable language to approach these sections of Mishnah, so he wrote these. And I always felt that they, whether he intended or not, it was a preparatory exercise for his Mishnah Torah. Professor Moshe Habatal told me point blank, it definitely was a preparatory exercise for Mishnah Torah. So now let's discuss now the Rambam's introduction to his commentary to Avos. Here we go. I'm going to get back to the top here. I was looking at something. Here it is. Hagdam. Okay. Rambam says, we've already described in the beginning of this composition, namely his commentary to the Mishnah and the original introduction. He gave a reason why each thing followed each thing. He gave an order for inside a Seder, inside of Zroim, he gave the order. Inside of Moed, everything. So in the Zikin, he said as follows. Mahasibo asher hiniya hamachaber likvo azos hamasechta b'zeh haseder. V'zacharnu gam ken godol hatoelis b'zos hamasechta. He says, I described there the reason that moved the Mechaber, Rabbeinu HaKadosh, the author of the Mishnah. Why did he put this Maseches Avos in this place? It follows Maseches Sanhedrin. So if it follows Maseches Sanhedrin, it means that he says that it means that it's meant for judges. The judges have to have a character that is of a much higher quality than ordinary people because of the responsibility that they carry on their shoulders in order to judge properly. And that's why we have Maseches Avos, that it's written for judges. And he shows that, and he indicates a number of the matters that are discussed in this Masechta and why they really are very helpful for judges and why they are pertinent. And we also promised earlier, we will speak about useful things in this Masechta. Because we will expand on our commentary in this Masechta, Maseches Avos. Because this Maseches, even though it's easy to understand what the statements in this Masechta are, he says, in short, it's easy. The material in this Masechta is easier said than done. First, and furthermore, v'gam, lo kol inyanehu muvanim b'li perish maspik. Not everything is really completely understood without a sufficient explanation. And on top of that, im heyosam avio l'shleimus rabo, this brings to great, namely following the teachings of this Masechta, brings to great perfection, and the true success. Okay. All right. Ukvar amru alehem hashalom. And Chachamim, I think it's a quote in Masachas Baba Kama. Hai mandan leboy lemahave chasida lekayem milei diavos. A person who wishes to be a chassid, he should fulfill the things that are written in Masachas Avos. Now he takes that statement and puts it together with another one. The highest level of human achievement beyond Chassidut is Nevuah. And the Chassidut is the pathway to Nevuah. Kamosh Yomru, Chassidut Mevio Lidei Ruach HaKodesh. Hinei Boer, Midivrehem, Shema HaMaaseh B'Musarei Zos HaMasechta, living out the ethical epigrams in this Maseches brings Mevi El HaNevuah. Mibni Shehi Koleles Chelik Gadol Mima'alos HaMidos. V'hinenu Asidim Levorah Amitas Davar Zeh. And we will now explain this, okay? All right, just as a side point, because it's interesting in its own right, this phrase, Chasidus Mevioli de Ruach HaKodesh, that's a full statement of Rabbi Pinchas Barabi Yoyer. And he gives a whole collection of steps. Torah brings to Zehirus, brings to Zrizus, brings to Nikiyus, up, till you finally get to Chasidus. Chasidus Mevioli de Ruach HaKodesh, and Ruach HaKodesh Mevioli de Tchias HaMesim. This statement ended up as the organizing principle of a very famous book from the beginning of the 18th century of Rabbeinu Moshe Chaim Luzzatto from Padua. Okay, his book is the Mesilas Yesharim, and I studied it in the yeshivas as part of the half hour of Musar every single day. We studied that book. There were other books as well, but that is sort of the main one. The Hebrew in that book is unbelievably accessible. Its simplicity and its freshness is reminiscent almost of the Rambam's Mishnah Torah, okay? Except the Rambam's Mishnah Torah is legal, and this is about development of the personality. Not only that, it's an interesting point that Moshe Chaim Luzzatto is credited by a lot of scholars as the founder of modern Hebrew, that he cast off the old rabbinic Hebrew, whether in general writing, in Kabbalistic writing, instead he got away from the language of the Zohar, whether in prayers, whether in poetry, his version of piyut was a different style of writing from the traditional. It was fresh modern Hebrew, and he even wrote secular poetry in all of his writings, okay? He brought a fresh new Hebrew, and with books on dikduk, etc. He was interested, among other things, in Hebrew for itself. Okay, and that he ended up having tremendous influence. The genius. We got into trouble with where people perceived that he was having messianic pretensions. You have to talk to the historians as who's right there, but. He flamed out. He died at 37 years old. So it's one of these geniuses who was unbelievably creative, inventive, new, original, but who really flame out. So it's a side point I wanted to bring up. It's sort of good to know it. Most people aren't aware of that. Okay, let's go back to the introduction. And I thought to give an introduction. Before I give a comment to every single Mishnah, we always say each unit in the Mishnayos is a Mishnah. The Rambam always says halacha. So before I give a commentary to what we say each Mishnah, Prakim Mo'ilim, I wanted to have early chapters, a bit short, they're full-blown essays, okay? People will get to them preliminary principles. That these preliminary principles will actually be a key. Namely, they're valuable in their own right, and they're valuable as the key to what follows. And no. Kidvorim asher omaro sam be'elu haprokim, things that I will say in these chapters. Ubameshi yavo min haperush. Enom inyonim shechidashti me'ani me'atzmi v'lo perushim shebedisim. He claims no originality to the things that he's going to discuss in these 8 chapters. There's one spot where he mentions something that is his own. Okay, only one spot. He mentions something as his own. But in general, okay, it's not his. Namely, it is material from our traditional sources. From the early and late philosophers. And know the truth from whoever says it. So Michael Schwartz in a footnote says that the scholar Soros Strumsa said to him, "Dishmahu emes misha amara" is not an original phrase with the Rambam, but rather it had already appeared in the 9th century in some Arabic writer. So apparently, people who had unusual things to say would always argue, "Don't worry about who's saying it. Worry about whether it's true or not." He says, I might even copy something straight out of a book. There's nothing wrong with this. I'm not taking credit for something that somebody before me had said. Don't accuse me of plagiarism, because I admit in advance that I'm taking material from other people. Even though I don't give the pedigree of what I'm saying, namely the source, I'm not interested in who said it. I'm interested if it's correct. Okay? And there's another reason for not saying something. Because if I start quoting something from somebody else, and that person has no appreciation, it's undeveloped, okay? Such a person, if I tell you who said it, they'll say, if he said it, I don't want to listen to it. Can you imagine walking into base measures and quoting something from Al-Farabi? They'll throw you out before you get a chance to say anything, okay? A person will think that it's not worth listening to. Not only that, it even has an evil in it. This person doesn't know anything, but he thinks it is something he doesn't even want to know about. So therefore, I don't want to mention who says it. I only care that you get, I care about what the reader gets, not by the source from which the reader gets it. And I want to teach him the things that are hidden in this Masechta. So there's a question: who are these people that he is quoting? Okay. Well, it seems that Rambam, of course, could have read the original Arabic translations of the classical authors, okay? And there is a pair of articles by Herbert Davidson on exactly which authors did he read and at what stages in his life. Most importantly, anybody who writes about, if the Rambam's introduction to ethics, his ethical theory was what she's going to teach, immediately does his compare and contrast, usually with Aristotle's Nicomachean Ethics, of which there was an Arabic translation, okay? And in the lifetime of the Rambam, Averroes says that in Spain they only had 4 of the 7, I think it's 7 books. They only have 4 of them in Spain, but the full book is in Egypt. So by the time the Rambam got to Egypt, he certainly had the book available to him. So in theory, it is quite possible that the Rambam read the original Nicomachean Ethics in translation, but he read the full thing. Okay. Herbert Davidson goes through it and finds too many disparities between the Rambam's formulation and the way it's dealt, things are dealt with in the Nicomachean Ethics. He finds too many disparities and too much, I'll mention the other philosophers, too much in sync with people who summarized or who used the Nicomachean Ethics. He finds only one place where he picks up a theme that is in the Nicomachean Ethics and not in other authors. Okay, he's only one. So his feeling is that by the age of 40, when he finished Mishnah Torah, he had never read the Nicomachean Ethics completely in Arabic translation. He only read people who used it, and I'll mention it in a moment, who they are, etc. Okay. By the time he wrote the Moreh, Herbert Davidson is convinced that he already had gone through the whole thing, because he actually literally quotes from the 2 various sections of the Ethics of Aristotle. Okay, that's number 1. Let's put that out of the way. Who are the 3 philosophers that were most influential for the Rambam? The Al-Farabi from 872 to 950. The Ibn Sina, or if you'll see him quoted as Avicenna, okay, from 980 to 1037, and Al-Ghazali from 1056 to 1111. You can check out, small thumbnail descriptions of their work on, you can find it on Wikipedia, although they have to be in a place where there's no politics involved. There's no ideological battles going on. Otherwise, Wikipedia is the Wild West. Or they're also in the Stanford online, Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy. Maybe next time I'll post the URLs for the Stanford Encyclopedia. Okay. It's quite clear that in ethics, as far as ethics is concerned, Al-Farabi wrote 2 books, Aphorisms of a Statesman. Okay. Aphorisms of a Statesman, and selected aphorisms. And it's quite clear that the Rambam took most of his material for here, his philosophical material here, is sort of from he's most influenced by the selected aphorisms. Herbert Davidson's conjectures that 5% is literally lifted from there, word for word, okay, verbatim. And he says about half of the purely philosophical discussions, are paraphrases of full quotes from Al-Farabi's selected aphorisms. Okay. So it's clear that the purely philosophical discussions are very highly, especially in the first chapter, there's a section that is literally lifted from Al-Farabi. And it's probably the most basic foundational part of the chapter. Okay. So we'll discuss that in detail when we get there, of course. That's number 1, the Al-Farabi. The second thing I want to speak about is that even though the Rambam was highly influenced by these Arabic philosophers that came before him, he was far from an acolyte that simply slavishly followed them. He was far from it. Here's a first place to see it, okay, over here. Let's take a look at this. אצלנו מעלו מן החסידות אלא הנבואה, והיא מביאה אליך, כמו שאמרו, חסידות מביא לידי רוח הקודש. Yeah? The Rambam said in the introduction that the book was for judges. All of a sudden, the stakes are going up. We're not talking about judges. We're talking about preparing people for prophecy. And there is no specific person here mentioned, right? This is Moshe Rabbeinu, who says, "U'miyiten kalam Hashem neviim, ki yitein Hashem yisrucho aleihem." The Rambam has quietly moved from Shoftim, which he started out with, back in the comment in the introduction to the Mishnah, to everyone that this Maseches is the path for everyone to reach the highest level of human existence, the Ruach HaKodesh, the knowledge of God, the direct knowledge of God, of whatever is possible for a human being. Now, his Arabic philosophers didn't think in those terms, because the Aristotelian tradition was that the Comedian Ethics Aristotle himself says it's written for political leaders. Political leaders have to have this highest ethical character in order that they can properly be the leaders of the state, of the polis of the state. Okay, since this tradition came down through Al-Farabi through, okay, and even in the modern discussions of the Rambam, there was a major debate between those who claim that the Rambam at the end really held by the Platonic ideal of political activity is the highest form, political leadership is the highest form of human existence, to provide for the welfare of the state, okay, through leadership, and which requires the most highly developed person, okay, and others who say no, that he was much more an Aristotelian in the sense that he held that the highest level of human existence is knowledge of God, is theoretical knowledge, okay? Well, the Rambam here quite clearly rejects, just very clearly rejects the issue of the political leadership. He moves completely away from the Aristotelian, from the tradition that came down through Aristotle, okay, about ethics being for political leadership, to saying that now ethics serves the highest level of human existence in itself, which is Ruach HaKodesh. The practicalities of ethics have disappeared, if you know. Namely, the practicalities of ethical behavior have gone off the table. So this is of extreme importance, okay? All right, so I think that's all we'll do today. I think that's all we'll do today. And we'll pick up the story next time with the first chapter, okay? I won't publish the PDF file that I publish next time will be the same as this. I might add some stuff at the end as an appendix. So if you've already printed this out, don't bother to print the whole thing out next time. Just go to the pages that might be new. Okay? All right, so that's it.